Hey, this week we're on Generations of Praise, Chapter 8, which is the post-reformation. The space in which they worshipped was the Baroque style, which was mentioned in the previous chapter, and nothing really big changed right there. But in Asia, where new churches were coming up, they took on an Oriental look. At the time that they met was the same. Roman Catholic, the clergy, they attended daily. But the others, the congregation, they attended weekly at best. And Protestantism, if people lived apart from another or great distances from cities, it was like a luxury to have church once a week. American Frontier, the baptisms, weddings, funerals, they had to be postponed until a minister could visit the area. I thought that was really interesting that they had to wait on ministers to come and preach and do the services. The orders of worship didn't change very much for the Eastern churches because they weren't affected by the Reformation. They stayed the same. Churches around Zurich changed a little to Zwingli's service by introducing hymns and music because he was against that. Lutherans kept their services very similar to the original, and Presbyterians made the standard of their services to the Westminster Directory of Public Worship of God, and that was under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. John Cotton designed a much simpler service for the New Colony's Puritans. Baptists were made a more simple service, just like the Puritans. The Quakers did something very different. The Society of Friends, they sat in silence and waited for the Spirit of God to move for someone to speak. So they were mostly the only ones that really changed anything to the way worship was. The Methodist movement held its ties to the Anglican Church, but they began to develop their own practices and governance. The Lord's Supper during this time, the Roman Catholic Mass remained a service centered around the Eucharist. Sunday morning service for the Protestants was centered on the Lord's Supper. Puritans practiced communion every month, and then related to the Puritans, the Congregationalists, they found it difficult to do communion every month because as they kept spreading west, they were farther away from ministers and the likelihood that a minister could be there for service every month. Music during this time, music kept flourishing. The composition and use of music flourished. The organ became a very popular instrument and worship instrument. Many songs and compositions were made for the organ and worship. Bach insisted everything he composed was for the glory of God, and I didn't realize that he wrote so much music for the church and everything was for the church. A lot of his stuff was really complicated for the instruments that they had at that time, but everything he did for the glory of God, or so he said. The songs began to be written so the congregation could sing and were able to sing. The tradition of hymns arose from this era. Isaac Watts was the pioneer poet for these worship songs, hymns. Preaching, it turned into a scholastic style of defense of doctrinal statements, but the preaching of the gospel still flourished. They didn't have seminary schools like we do now, so preaching education wasn't easy to find, and therefore good preachers were not available everywhere. Lancelot Andrewes polished the art of preaching. He would read from Scripture, then show the application to the Word of the lives of the congregation. John Cotton was a very good preacher for the Puritans in the American colonies. Increase Mather was also a very well-known preacher. He studied at Harvard and Trinity College in Dublin, and then perfected his preaching in England. And the best-known preacher of the American Puritanism is Jonathan Edwards. He's still read as a philosopher, theologian, and reporter of the life in the colonies in New England. George Whitefield was known as the best preaching for the Methodists, and It's said that he preached to more people than anyone else before the age of modern communication technology. So before any of that happened, he was the guy that could speak to thousands of people. Um, so a summary of this chapter, there wasn't really any new patterns of corporate worship except for the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who sat in silence and did things very much differently. But other than that, things were pretty normal.